Good evening. And to those of you joining from the Asia Pacific, good morning. My name is James Siebens, and I'm a fellow with the Defense Strategy and Planning Program here at the Stimson Center in Washington, D.C. Thank you for joining us for an event to mark the release of our recent report on the role of military operations other than war in China's foreign policy and strategy. As many of you are likely aware, this past June, China's President Xi Jinping approved a set of trial guidelines to provide a legal underpinning for non-war military operations, also translated as military operations other than war. This announcement drew greater attention to what I think has been an underappreciated part of China's military doctrine, even though it's often discussed in the news in a more piecemeal fashion, for example, in the form of rights protection or law enforcement missions or military exercises. Now, according to the public outline of President Xi's order, the primary objectives of these guidelines are first, to prevent and neutralize risks and challenges to China's interests, in effect through deterrence. Second, to maintain national sovereignty and regional stability. And third, to standardize and regulate the PLA's planning and conduct of its non-war military operations. Now, if you've read our report, you'll know that it's primarily an effort to take stock of what military operations other than war means in a practical sense for China, and hopefully to advance our understanding of the purposes for which China uses its armed forces during peacetime. Now, to help us unpack the diverse elements of China's military operations other than war, and to help us better understand how China thinks about their utility and how it has incorporated them into its foreign policy, I'm delighted to be joined by an outstanding panel of experts with rich experience working on these issues. Andrea Ghiselli is an assistant professor at the School of International Relations and Public Affairs at Fudan University. He wrote the book on China's efforts to protect its overseas interests, which it has largely done through military operations other than war. Courtney Fung is an associate professor in the Department of Security Studies and Criminology at Macquarie University. She's written extensively on China's somewhat complex relationship with international humanitarian intervention and UN peacekeeping operations, and particularly China's efforts to establish itself as a responsible stakeholder in global order. Jesse Marks is a non-resident fellow with the Stimson Center's China program and has worked on and written about these issues, especially as related to China's political and military relationships in the Middle East. He and I have actually recently co-authored a chapter on China's military operations other than war as part of a forthcoming volume that I'm editing on China's use of military and paramilitary forces for purposes of coercion and political influence, much of which involves military operations other than war. Thank you all for joining me for this discussion. Now, before I ask each of you to share your views on some of the topics covered in the report, I'd like to provide a bit of a summary for anyone who may not have yet read the report, and to briefly explain the vantage from which I approach this subject. I'd also like to start by recognizing my co-author on the report, my former colleague Ryan Lucas, who served as the Defense Strategy and Planning Program's resident sinologist before going into government. Now, this report would not have been possible without his expert knowledge of China's military and strategic discourse. So my work is focused on the role of military force in great power competition, especially its functions in supporting or advancing foreign policy short of war. That is, short of sustained armed conflict. One of the central insights that I've gained from working closely with Dr. Barry Blechman, one of the co-founders of the Stimson Center, is that the majority of what the military does to contribute to foreign policy is not actually fighting and winning the nation's wars, but rather shaping the international environment and attempting to shape the perceptions and behaviors of other states through signaling, coercion, and military diplomacy, among other things. In 2020, Dr. Blechman, along with Dr. Melanie Sisson and I, published a book entitled Military Coercion and U.S. Foreign Policy, The Use of Force Short of War, which was a study of post-Cold War U.S. operations that were intended to advance specific, defined objectives vis-a-vis other actors. And as part of that study, I co-authored a chapter on military operations other than war. Now, though that concept later fell out of favor, the US DoD's Joint Doctrine for Military Operations Other than War provided a framework for articulating the various ways in which the US military engaged in operations to shape the international environment and to support its efforts to work alongside partners and pursue diplomatic objectives in peacetime. So this involved joint military exercises and training, conducting peacekeeping operations and counterterrorism operations, providing humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, etc., all intended as a means of advancing security objectives and as a means of deepening practical political and military cooperation with other countries and attempting to develop goodwill. In effect, to demonstrate US global leadership. Building on the approach to that book, I decided to examine how the Chinese military thinks about the political use of their armed forces. Over the past 2 years, I've partnered with a number of talented next-generation scholars, practitioners, and analysts to conduct what I hope will be one of the more comprehensive examinations to date, focusing specifically on how China uses its military and paramilitary forces short of armed conflict for purposes of coercion to shape the behavior of others. Now, this report on military operations other than war emerged as it became clear to me just how much China has focused on its non-war military operations and has really tried to learn from the experiences of the US military and to adopt or adapt military concepts and lessons from the US to suit China's circumstances and needs. Just as the US was moving away from the military operations other than war framework in the early 2000s, China was taking it up in earnest. In my view, military operations other than war doctrine encapsulates much of the strategic logic of China's employment of its armed forces, not only to produce psychological and political effects, but also to develop operational concepts and competencies, to deepen its international military relationships, and to demonstrate China's aspiration to act as a global power. As noted in the report, China's non-war military operations fall into several broad categories, including international peacekeeping, military exercises and military diplomacy, counterterrorism and stability maintenance, maritime rights and interests protection, counter-piracy and far seas escort missions, humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, and non-combatant evacuation operations. China has engaged in all of these types of operations during the past 20 years. I think it's important to note that some of these operations involve deploying military forces abroad, while others have clearly a more domestic focus or a clear defensive or deterrence function. Likewise, while some may have a coercive intent, others do not, and arguably some of China's operations may actually contribute to shared goals of international peace and security. For example, China has participated heavily in multinational counter-piracy operations in the Gulf of Aden, and its participation in international peacekeeping operations has drawn praise from the UN and others. The PLA has also contributed to international humanitarian assistance and disaster relief with unprecedented frequency since 2010. In the past decade, China has deployed its military to respond to natural disasters in Nepal, the Philippines, and Japan, as well as epidemics in Sierra Leone and Liberia. Now, at the same time, the PLA's growing international role has raised concerns over how these new military capabilities may affect other countries' security. Conducting these missions has arguably allowed the PLA to improve its ability to plan and sustain expeditionary operations in a way that may arguably make Beijing more capable of using force abroad in general. There are also examples of military operations other than war that are simply problematic or controversial, such as the Chinese Coast Guard's rights protection missions around disputed maritime features, from the Senkaku Islands to the in the East China Sea to the James Shoal off the coast of Borneo. Now, to this day, Chinese Navy and Coast Guard patrols in the South and East China Seas that are intended to uphold China's sovereignty and jurisdictional claims directly enable the routine harassment of foreign vessels around these disputed features. Finally, China has used international military exercises as a platform for deeper military and diplomatic cooperation with countries across Asia, especially with Russia and other members of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. So there's a lot on the table here. To talk about all of these important and complex issues, I've asked some of the scholars whose work has heavily informed my research on this topic to share some of their reactions to the report and to share their views on different aspects of how and why China has placed so much emphasis on developing doctrine and capabilities for military operations other than war. And I'll note that if people in the audience have questions, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen and send those along. And we'll try to address as many questions as we can during the discussion. And please note if you have specific panelists in mind when posing your questions. So, Andrea, I'd like to start with you. You've done some really important work, as I noted at the beginning, on China's efforts to protect its overseas interests, which is really one of the essential functions of military operations other than war. So I want to start by posing the question, what roles have military operations other than war played in the protection of Chinese interests abroad? And how have you seen Chinese thought about military operations other than war evolve over time?
So good morning, everyone. Or good evening, sorry. It's morning here in Shanghai. Before I start with my comments, I want to thank again James and the Stimson Center for inviting me to this event. It's a great pleasure. It's unfortunate that it's online instead of in person, but well, travel and time zones prevent us to be there. So nonetheless, and I also invite everyone in the audience to really read the report. This will be my first comment, actually. The report is extremely well researched. I'm a bit of a nerd when it comes to footnotes and bibliography, and I think the two authors of this report did a great job in really using a variety of sources in providing a very comprehensive overview of what's the Chinese thinking, but also some of the outcomes and some of the Chinese actions with regard to this kind of very diverse operations. Which is really something that we should keep in mind, because although we have a useful label, right, military operations other than war, in reality, they include pretty much anything that is not war to a large extent. Even I believe also Chinese sources to a large extent categorize this kind of operation is in this way. It's a concept that's been evolving over time, somehow borrowing beginning from US doctrine and then been transformed and changed according to the policy changes of the Chinese government and the Chinese defense and foreign policy machine. And so I think this remains to a large extent a work in progress, first of all. If we look at Chinese sources such as if you look at Chinese sources, we see that that's still the case. Now, military operations at war are separated from other operations, such as war operations and deterrence operations. So that's an important development, but it's very likely that will keep changing, probably. And that, again, because they're very diverse operations in the first. And so the policy needs that are meant to address will change over time. So with regard to the specific regard to the protection of China's interest overseas, I would like just to make 2 points, one about the past and one about possible future, although predictions are always very difficult to make. About the past, I think in general, it's important, of course, to notice, as James and his co-author do in the report, that the military, the PLA, and also, of course, PAP, have become somehow important tools that Chinese policymakers want to have in their policy menu, if needed to be. And that was not necessarily a smooth process in their thinking, but it was a very crisis-driven process with the evacuation from Libya in 2011, playing a crucial role, somehow making all the most important actors within the Chinese system to kind of toe the line and agree that the PLA should do something, or at least should be ready to do something. I think the key word here is to be ready. Because yes, the PLA played somewhat more kind of, I would say, formal role rather than a substantial role in Libya, a much more important role in Yemen, in 2015. Kearney will talk about peacekeeping, of course, which remains an important component of Chinese operations overseas. But I would say I think it's important to emphasize that there have been a series of developments inside China to prepare the PLA to operate overseas. But the PLA has not actually expanded that much its operations overseas. I think this is an important element I should keep in mind. So an increase in capabilities, but not necessarily in terms of behavior. And I think this is an important thing. And there are a number of reasons behind that. And I think that, thinking about those reasons also help us to think about the future. One of them is definitely the global environment, especially, which is probably just another way to say Sino-US relations in reality. Especially because I think in the period in which Chinese military operation, Chinese thinking about these kind of operations as developed was tended to be a relatively relaxed period in Sino-US relations, especially compared to today. But that has changed a lot. And I think it's possible to find comments by Chinese civilian and military analysts, which is quite clear that today the real focus, Asia has always been the focus of Chinese diplomacy and Chinese defense, but that is especially true today. And I think that somehow has been taking away oxygen, really, or willingness to think about global military footprint or projection, because resources must be focused, nearby home, on the borders, and so on, and generally speaking in Asia. And so, we just had the meeting between President Xi and President Biden. Let's see what that actually mean for Sino-US relations. But nonetheless, I will not be surprised if we will not see significant changes in the patterns of Chinese military operations that war overseas in the coming years, as in any case, the relations between China and the United States remain quite tense, especially in Asia. So I will not be surprised if the Chinese prefer to focus, in their own neighborhood rather than in other faraway regions. I'm not saying a decrease of their presence, but nonetheless, not an increase. And I saw in the audience there also Isaac Cardon. He just published a couple of very good papers on Chinese investment in ports and their implications for power projection overseas. And I think he also makes a lot of good points about the structural factors that might limit Chinese military footprint overseas, at least in conventional terms. And I think this is also true when it comes to such kind of operations. Another point that another factor we should keep in mind, and then I will stop, is this. I'm sharing just my screen for a moment. This is the number of Chinese workers employed in construction projects overseas. You see, it's been growing until essentially COVID broke out, and you see that pretty much the number has halved since then. Now there are no more recent data, so we're waiting for the 21 data, but probably they will be very similar. So a much smaller human footprint overseas, which also means far less urgency, a much smaller demand for the Chinese government to actually think about protecting, possibly in a military way, those citizens overseas. Now, I'm not saying that this will remain the case forever. Maybe there will be a rebound once traveling restrictions will be lifted, but maybe not, because of course these workers are closely tied to the Belt and Road Initiative also. But that initiative has been changing due to financial concerns, also changes in terms from labor intensive to attempts to turn it into a more tech intensive initiative. So fewer people on the ground, especially in the developing world. So I think, long story short, we should not take for granted that there will be an actual transition from preparing for the use of the military to actually using it to protect citizens overseas. I think it makes a lot of sense if you're a policymaker to prepare, but as analysts, as outsiders, people outside Joanna High, we should be open at least to the possibility that such transition will not happen, or will not happen as automatically as it's often, I think, implicitly expressed in some reports, not this one, but in some reports or other statements by policymakers. So I will stop here, and congratulations again for the great report.
Thanks so much, Andrea. And thank you especially for noting the emphasis on readiness. I think that there is a real kind of focus in PLA thinking on concepts of readiness and jointness. But then the other thing that comes out of the literature on military operations other than war is the importance of close adherence to political direction, right? And that military operations have to fundamentally serve political ends and have to be conducted carefully so as to not inadvertently undermine the political ends that they're pursuing. A lot of these operations, as I think you noted with the non-combatant evacuation operations, require that the armed forces respond quickly without prior planning to some kind of an unexpected crisis or emergency. Same with natural disasters, right? If we could predict all the earthquakes in advance, maybe there could be careful preparation, but in reality, militaries have to basically spring into action in response. And so China's thought about military operations other than war requiring state of heightened readiness and agility is, I think, especially important. And I think we would find a lot of consistency between those thoughts about the importance of readiness and joint operations as well in the US defense literature. The other thing that I think you noted appropriately is, having clear integration between the different actors within the Chinese security apparatus. These are intended to be coordinated actions between People's Armed Police or militia units and the different government law enforcement agencies that might be involved in different operations. So thank you for all of those points. Now, Courtney, I'd like to turn to you next. You've studied China's engagement in the UN Security Council on humanitarian intervention questions, and also China's participation in UN peacekeeping missions. China's been more actively engaged in peacekeeping operations in recent decades, as you well know. For example, in 2012 and 2013, China deployed security forces to South Sudan and Mali, principally for kind of guarding headquarters and that sort of thing. But then they sent a fairly sizable infantry battalion to the UN mission in South Sudan a few years later. So I wanted to ask you essentially how you have understood China's value in pursuing a prominent role in international peacekeeping operations. Both what benefits does China see in doing so, and what benefits does that have maybe for the UN system as a whole, perhaps?
Great. Well, thank you again, James and colleagues at the Stimson Center for hosting this session. I would just like to echo Andrea's comments to give a very strong recommendation for those that haven't had the time yet to read the report, for a very concise, clearly written, and definitely for all of us footnote nerds out there, well-cited and well-resourced research paper. And I think it's a real contribution to sort of an update of where we are in the here and now, especially on this debate about military operations other than war in Chinese foreign policy. I will definitely focus my comments on the peacekeeping space as invited by James, and maybe I can sort of deal with the UN end first. I think it's very important to recognize that China's become an increasingly important player within the United Nations space. It's now become the second largest budget contributor to both the regular budget and also the peacekeeping budget. These are both indexed to sort of measurements of GDP, GNI. And as China likes to frequently point out, it pays its dues on time and in full, unlike, quote unquote, the largest debtor to the UN system, which we all know is a very polite or perhaps impolite euphemism for the United States. At the same time, China has grown to be the most prolific contributor to UN peacekeeping in terms of troops out of the permanent members at the UN Security Council. It only deploys through UN peacekeeping. China has no alternate platforms through NATO, through the EU, through coalitions of the willing. And so it focuses its peacekeeping energy through the UN. And I'd say that this is a very important move, that there is real demand for Chinese assets and a real demand for the types of assets that China sends. Most recently, as sort of James is hinting at, China has moved into deploying combat troops, which I'll circle back to in a minute. But really its record for sort of, since the late 1980s has been deploying the most hard to find, arguably the most expensive type of asset, the enabler troops that help get a mission off the ground. So the logisticians, the medical teams, the engineers that really provide the backbone to an operation working out in the field. And for many reasons, these are difficult troops to locate, and we can talk about that in the Q&A if that comes up. So again, China's meeting a great demand, and it sees a real benefit because as much as China wants to explain itself and its global governance position, it wants to be able to back up its claims that it is going to be a key contributor to the United Nations, that the UN and all of its laws and principles and institutions are a bulwark to the functioning of our international system, that China is a great believer in the UN Charter and its bedrock principles regarding state sovereignty and territoriality. And so participating in peacekeeping allows China to differentiate itself as a great power that actually walks the walk, that goes along when it talks the talk. It also allows China to stand shoulder to shoulder with its developing nation Global South partners, as they typically make up the bulk of UN peacekeeping troop contributions. Really, these are coming from states like India, Pakistan, Ethiopia, Rwanda, etc. And so China can really say that it understands the concerns of the Global South by operating as such. And so there are a few of these sort of reputational status-based gains. And of course, there's the real hard practicalities that both Andrea and James are talking about in terms of, real preparation for potential readiness, joint operations in austere foreign environments. And these are all learning incubator opportunities for China in terms of sharpening and preparing the PLA for what potential overseas operations there might be in a totally acceptable, internationally legitimate space, which UN peacekeeping provides. So I guess with that sort of overview, I would just like to point out, though, that while China has been a very enthusiastic supporter, I think we can still think about two sort of questions that China's peacekeeping participation leaves us with. And I think the first off is how peacekeeping and military operations other than war fit into China's broader vision for international politics and global governance. Sometimes it's called this community for a shared future for humankind, for mankind. Sometimes it's just called a shared future. And this is a largely state-centric approach to how international politics should work. States have a much larger say, and this isn't to mean that all states have an equal say, but it's meant to say that there is perhaps less room for civil society, NGOs and non-state groups that might want to advance a more Western liberalized agenda. This shared future vision will place China within the center of a series of flexible partnership networks that will help sort of, again, cement China's real pole position as sort of the leading state, helping to reform and bring into life this multipolar era that apparently we are all entering. And so what does that really mean? These are sort of very broad concepts, right? And I think actually by looking at peacekeeping and by the fact that it hasn't all been smooth sailing for Beijing as a peacekeeping participant, this really is this sort of lens to help us understand what this broad shared future vision might mean. And so in my last minute, I'd just like to fast forward to the comments that James had made in reference to sort of China's deployment in deploying 2012, 2013, deploying its first combat troop deployments out to Mali and out to South Sudan, and how these have not been necessarily easy operations for Beijing. And I think that part is relatively frank in the publicly available Chinese language media, and also, in the elite discourse amongst academics and sort of the occasional chit chat that we will see coming through in the foreign ministry's Q&A sessions. The reason why I cite this is because both these missions and both these deployments have seen deaths by quote unquote malicious acts when peacekeepers have been purposely targeted and killed. And these are China's first combat deaths in decades, really since the 1979 Sino-Vietnamese War. And in many ways, China's debate about whether or not, quote unquote, these deaths are worth it, concerns that China, quote, cannot passively take a beating, end quote, out in the field, has really prompted a thinking about how China can approach peacekeeping as this particular entry point for understanding its role in international politics when perhaps consent-based operations are not going to be offered, and when consent is potentially quite contentious. And so in closing, I'd just like to note that these types of mortalities, these types of deaths in the field, have really prompted some very interesting thinking coming out of Beijing, which again is helping us to understand what this shared future, this community for humankind logic looks like on the ground. And so we've seen in the last year or two a movement where China has been seeking to offer its own vision for how it will support peacekeeper safety and security out in the field. And so its efforts are kind of unsurprising, I think, for those that follow this space. In as much as Beijing is very clear that it's looking to see the host state, i.e. what South Sudan and Mali can do to help promote medical evacuation. It's looking to have better types of training, capacity building pre-deployment and during deployment, because again, counterintuitive from what the narrative tells us, but the vast majority of peacekeeper deaths are due to accident and illness. So better training, better equipment, better medical needs met will actually save quite a few peacekeepers' lives and therefore allow the peacekeeping mission to run more smoothly. And I guess somewhat unsurprisingly, China has little to say on questions about the use of force, even though China actually was largely funding the Cruz report, which was seminal in its statement that really peacekeepers need to be able to meet force with force. On that part, China's remained quite quiet. But I think we're really looking at this entry point now over the next couple of years of how China will sort of take this platform, not only in terms of funding, in terms of mandating, in terms of deploying, but also using this platform to try and gain a larger voice in terms of international policy design in the peacekeeping space, and in particular as a platform for itself within the United Nations. So thank you again, and I look forward to Jesse's comments in the discussion.
Thanks very much, Courtney. Excellent points. And I think the final point about having a major power, both shaping policy and contributing to the kind of operational debate in the UN Security Council, as well as being on the leading edge or a direct participant in peacekeeping operations, is going to be a different kind of dynamic in that space. So Jesse, I'd like to turn to you next, last but not least, to ask if there are any lessons about China's military engagements abroad that you think are worth highlighting from either your academic work on this subject or your policy experience looking at China's overseas security activities. And if you'd like, you could, I'd invite you to touch on kind of the increasing focus on security within Chinese diplomacy.
Thank you, James. It's an honor to be here. Also, to be on such a distinguished panel, it's a pleasure. Thank you both for your comments. And also, I encourage everyone out there to go read this report. It is fantastic. I've gotten to see the blood, sweat, and tears put into it and echo the praises of my colleagues. I think it's a very good benchmark for where things currently stand, and will be, I think, an important document in terms of building further knowledge on this topic. So I highly encourage you to go out and read it. Also, a shameless plug for the forthcoming book by our illustrious moderator, James Stevens. So we look forward to seeing the rollout of that book. To jump right in, I think three of the key takeaways from the report, one of which I'll be building my comments off of, I think are worth highlighting. One, as James mentioned in his introduction, the PRC is a learning power who learns from other peer competitors, particularly in the defense and security space. I think two, the PRC's broader foreign policy objectives in military operations other than war is advancing strategic interests under the existing international order, however, reflecting that this could, in the long term, precipitate an eventual reshaping of certain parts of the order that are more into a more China-friendly and malleable system. And kind of the latter, where I will focus my comments, is there has been an observable effort on the PRC's part to cultivate partnerships with regional powers and strategic regions, such as the Middle East, through the use of military operations other than war and pieces that come along with that, whether that's military diplomacy. But I do want to emphasize on that third point that it should not be emphasized or inflated to the extent that which mutual operations have kind of been employed and kind of cultivated significant influence with a lot of these partner states. So going back to 2014, Xu Jin and Li Wei from the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences wrote a really interesting exploratory paper on the concept of a strategic fulcrum state. And since then, the concept has gained traction among scholars, Chinese scholars particularly, that I've enjoyed digging into as an important feature in foreign policy and statecraft. In the view of several of these scholars, basically strategic fulcrum states are those that are cultivated to support the strategic ambitions of the PRC by leveraging their influence to advance the PRC's foreign policy objectives. The states that are typically pursued after as strategic fulcrums are middle powers, medium powers with unique local conditions, such as large populations, sizable economic capabilities, military capabilities, geostrategic locations, and resource and energy strength. And these fulcrums can use said regional influence and capabilities to build support among other nations and through multilateral regional platforms, such as the Arab League and the African Union, to bolster support for Chinese priorities and regional agendas. And these states ultimately, in this sense, serve both as a supporter and conduit of influence, as well as a force multiplier for Chinese interests and goals. In the context of mutual operations, I think the PRC has, for the latter part of a decade, even longer, has begun to identify and cultivate military fulcrums. These are states which enable Beijing specifically to advance security, defense, and military cooperation, while improving access and expanding power projection capabilities into strategic regions. Through this lens, mutual operations, covering the range of those that were introduced here, but also to kind of bring in other things like international military education training, IMET, as well as other forms of defense cooperation, serve a broader purpose and cultivating like-minded partners in strategic regions who are open not only to working with China at a minimum base level capacity, but also bolstering support for Chinese initiatives at the national, regional, and global level. Historically, mutual operations have been an important benchmark on the PLA's present capabilities, and at time have exposed significant gaps in their operational readiness and ability to project power to protect its overseas citizens. I think key examples that were highlighted were Libya, where we saw major gaps in the PLA's capabilities from supply and logistics to military assets. Though they were successful in rescuing upwards of 35,000 people, the process to get there exposed a number of gaps within the PLA's capabilities. Meanwhile, Yemen was actually, I would probably say, was an important milestone, reflecting the extent to which the PLA had actually bridged some of those operational gaps to address some of its operational demands in carrying out mutual operations. So in this sense, these gaps that have been exposed through these periods of actual operational implementation have compelled China to pursue strategic fulcrum countries in key regions in order to actually support and enhance Beijing's ability to project power to protect its interests and citizens overseas. We've seen since 2011 kind of operational reform within the PLA around bridging some of these gaps, and they've been able to utilize mutual operations to cultivate defense ties with partner states such as Saudi Arabia, Djibouti, different parts of strategic regions, highlighting those regions, particularly the Gulf of Aden. We've seen this particularly important in the Red Sea corridor, the Persian Gulf, and increasingly in the southern Mediterranean. And tangible examples of benefits such as the Chinese naval base in Djibouti to the construction of blended civilian maritime infrastructure at key SLOCs have been able the PLA to actually extend their ability to carry out Farsi's operations by having critical supply and logistics hubs across these strategic SLOCs. So how does this impact kind of the existing status quo around security in sensitive regions? Historically, I'm a MENA Middle East person, so I find the MENA region as a unique case study. But Beijing has put in a lot of time and a lot of effort to cultivate strategic partnerships in the MENA region, particularly around those key SLOCs and energy corridors that I just mentioned. And to an extent, the PRC's broader diplomatic efforts have yielded substantive gains, particularly in places like Iran, the GCC, Egypt, and more. But kind of going back to the initial point I made, mutual operations and military diplomacy more broadly have only played a marginal role in this. We look at BRI, the economic partnerships and cooperation, technical cooperation. These things tend to play a larger and more leading role. So I think it's important to temper to the extent that mutual operations have actually played in shaping diplomacy. But I do think it is an important one in places like Africa, where there have been fewer willing defense partners for African nations that in many cases were in need of, everything from counterterrorism support to just general kind of operational enhancement. The PRC has been pushing on an open door. Whereas in places like the Middle East, China has faced a number of challenges in cultivating partners who are historically U.S. major defense and security partners. I think on the one challenge in expanding cooperation that China has faced, both in mutual operations, but particularly around military diplomacy and security cooperation, is that even minor cooperation with U.S. partners has increased friction with the U.S. and open space for strategic misinterpretation and miscommunication on the sides of both the U.S., China, and their partners in those regions. We've seen this, for example, with PLA periodic military drills separately implemented with Saudi Arabia and Iran. Such drills often an effort by China to strategically balance its relationship with both sides by signaling a level of equivalency. However, the Saudis have seen growing Chinese-Iranian ties as a potential strategic advantage to Iran in the Gulf rivalry. And some US policymakers have seen Saudi participation as strategic posturing for China and a move away from its traditional place in kind of the US defense architecture. I think one opportunity that China has found through mutual operations, and particularly in its ability to build relationships with partners, is that building relationships with existing US partners is more of kind of a less is more approach. In that sense, China has been able to build influence among principal US partners by showing themselves as a present and willing partner rhetorically, without the actual need to fill any major decisive security role, one which they are most likely unlikely to fill. So rhetoric has played an important part here. And it's one of those things where there's not been a point or position where China has been called on to fill a major security role. However, there are increasing expectations among regional actors in the Middle East. One example being the Iran-Saudi conflict, where increasingly, at least, you're seeing conversations emerge about the role that China is playing on both sides, to the extent that they will be able to strategically balance security ties with both sides. China's efforts more broadly to bolster security cooperation is not likely to expand to the point of replacing or filling any such vacuum which the US currently occupies in the Middle East. I just want to emphasize that. I think there's often a lot of conversation within the policy space that tends to emphasize the extent to which China's cooperation is expanding and to the extent that it's undermining US interests. I just want to temper that. But in other words, China at best has been playing a supportive role and is unlikely to accept the role of security guarantor or even security supplier or security cooperation actor of choice in many of these regions. That could change in the long term if the PLA assume a more active role in regional security. But for the short to midterm, this seems relatively unlikely. And just concluding, there were kind of a few questions I wanted to pose in terms of thinking about this issue moving forward. If you pursue, James, another report to update these. But from a kind of global governance lens, we should, this question of how should we view mutual operations in practice moving forward, from a global governance perspective, we should judge PLA operations, mutual operations, particularly on the merits of their contributions to international security. I think that was one point that your report raised quite well. I think the second is more of a geostrategic question, which is we should evaluate the extent to which mutual operations, as part of kind of a broader diplomatic effort to cultivate influence among strategic partners, is actually effective in improving China's regional posture and its position, vis-a-vis partners, also vis-a-vis in the effectiveness of its mutual operations, security and military defense diplomacy. Putting on my MENA hat briefly, I think it's important to continue to monitor the implication of Chinese mutual operations and military diplomacy on critical factors such as interoperability of defense partners and things such as the US-led de-ISIS coalition. and its impacts on key defense architecture in the Gulf region, particularly around the implications for the Iran-Saudi rivalry, whether that is the Saudi-led coalition to combat, detain, deter, and in previous cases, isolate Iran. And then kind of stepping back from a China lens, I think the answer to the first three questions help us have an understanding to the extent to which China's military operations have bolstered the PLA's capabilities and improved its ability to actually project power to protect its interests in a lot of these strategic regions. And with that, I'll hand it back to you.
Outstanding. Thank you very much, Jesse. And I want to actually shift the conversation to just kind of an exchange here between all of us, focusing on one of the points that you made in your last few questions, which is about kind of how China's operations might contribute to global order versus exacerbate sense of international competition. I think there's a bit of a paradox there in that some of the major contributions that China might make to international peacekeeping or to playing an increasing role in the institutions of global governance is actually viewed through the lens of great power competition, and that global influence is being increasingly viewed in zero-sum terms, whether that's valid or not. So I wanted to ask all of you for your views briefly on kind of whether it's appropriate or inevitable to view a competition over influence in that way, or whether it is possible to compete and cooperate, as the U.S. government sometimes suggests. Anyone who'd like to weigh in on that?
Then I'll go first, since so there's also
Please.
a question for me from actually Isaac, Professor Cardon, about the possible participation of Chinese gas naval forces in the Gulf of Guinea. I think it's a very tricky question. Both yours, James, and Professor Cardon's, they're closely related. As of course Gulf of Guinea in West Africa, so Atlantic Ocean, maybe a bit too close to the North American homeland. So I like, as to the Gulf of Guinea, I honestly would be surprised if China would join such kind of operations. I probably would keep on playing a more indirect role, boosting capabilities of local actors. Also because the situation from a legal and jurisdictional point of view is a bit more complex there than, for example, the Gulf of Aden, and so I think that creates a series of questions for Chinese policymakers about the opportunity cost in terms of relations with local actors operating there, but also going to the great power element of the question. I think the Chinese are aware of the fact that probably a Chinese naval presence there will not be seen in a friendly way by people in Washington. I think in the past we had a lot of rumors and discussions about a possible Chinese base in West Africa. None of those comments really framing it as an opportunity for cooperation, really. And so I think the message was received quite well in Beijing. So going back to one of my points, I think great power competition remain a key factors in how China think about its global conduct. Probably the most important thing, more than non-traditional security issues or other things. So in a moment, as it seems now, maybe in which there are attempts on both sides to de-escalate a bit, at least try to stabilize the relationship. I would not be surprised if Chinese somehow tend to be a bit more cautious. So for example, refrain from expanding or showing the flag in places in which in the past, such as the Gulf of Guinea, American commentators and policymakers clearly said this is something we would not like to see. So, of course, that also means that in case of rising tensions, there might be also the opposite behavior, right? Like the tendency of showing the flags exactly in places where Americans would not like to see it. But for the moment, I think the general trend is still to avoid the escalation of tension between Beijing and Washington into a global security kind of competition, technological, economic competition maybe, but I don't think that there is any plan to do that to the global level in military terms. So as the center of operations in a way moves towards the Atlantic Ocean, and the United States probably also are much more cautious about it.
Courtney, to the question about viewing the peacekeeping operations and leadership roles in the UN and UN Security Council in particular through the lens of kind of jockeying for position, have you seen what sort of evidence or contrary evidence have you seen on that point?
Thanks, James. And I think I don't really have much to build on Andrea's very thorough comments. But I think just to turn to your first question, and I think this will also address the question you just asked me about sort of jockeying in the UN space, about the potential for coexistence more than perhaps competition. I think in a lot of ways, the UN helps legitimize appropriate competition. It helps set up minimum guardrails because the UN has a fixed structure of meeting schedules. If you don't come to a meeting, everyone knows. You're very loath to miss a meeting with the potential to negotiate with upwards of 190 states in one single setting. So it's really quite costly in a way that it's a separate cost when you decide to bilaterally remove meetings off your political agenda. And so I think the UN is a very important opportunity to sort of maximize the potential for coexistence. All of that said, even anti-piracy operations, that have some type of veneer of UN legitimacy, a UN Security Council resolution to reach back to, even discussions at the group of governmental experts, the open-ended working group on cyber, where again, they try to set up minimum guardrails about what types of cyber operations are appropriate, we could say, for international politics. And even on this topic of peacekeeping, as much as I've just said what I said, this is still very much a space for real competition to occur. And there's been an intense amount of interest, and I'd argue recently in the last couple of years, growing concern about what Beijing is doing within this peacekeeping space, for example. Efforts at sort of, again, attempts at leadership, efforts, again, with support from Russia and the United States to try and reduce human rights billets that are tied to peacekeeping budgets. Things like this have been sort of really seen as markers of sort of China's ascendancy within the UN system. But I think very much to pick up on comments offered, in the theme both by Jesse and Andrea, I think it's very important to look at the much longer historical record that we really have seen China become a far more flexible player in terms of trying to meet what the global norms and global movements are in terms of sort of really acceptable, great power, responsible power leadership. At the same time, this doesn't mean that China has done this with total compliance and totally being pliant in doing so. And so I think we do have to prepare ourselves, as China has made it clear that it wants to see UN reform, to have a UN that better fits current international circumstance. And the current circumstance that Beijing sees is one that now is making way for a multipolar world, which again is a euphemism for a no longer US-led pole position international system. So I think in a lot of ways, as much as we've been following sort of the outcome of the Xi and Biden visit, I think we do have to be prepared for this space in particular to see sort of a growing PRC presence, and that might start to see, again, this push for greater policy initiatives, whether this means going after particular human rights billets to decrease the funding for those as a means to protect the UN peacekeeping budget, though again, I should really stress that human rights billets are a tiny, tiny fraction of what the UN peacekeeping budget is composed of. Whether we see that as greater policy leadership, as I've just mentioned, that incubator space about how China is thinking through peacekeeper safety and security, my bet for this coming decade is that we will see a more leadership-seeking, policy advancing Beijing, even if this is only going to be on the margins, but it's certainly a precursor, I would argue, for where China wants to take its next decade within this peacekeeping space. Thanks.
Oh, thank you. And to your point about taking a kind of a longer view, I wanted to ask if anybody had thoughts on how military operations other than war as practiced and conceived of by China are illustrative or consistent with the new security concept or the PLA's new historic missions. Some of these bigger picture kind of strategies, I think, Andrea, you've made the case, I think, effectively, that a lot of the evolution of Chinese thinking on these operations has been reactive and has been driven by responses to necessity out of crises. But to what extent can we also trace a kind of thoughtful evolution of military operations other than war as a means of trying to shape the international environment and perceptions of China in a deliberate way?
Super tricky question.
Yes.
As it's always to interpret.
You have 2 minutes.
Very tricky question, as it's always the case when it comes to interpreting such kind of initiatives and concepts and so on. So just to be brief, and also very vague, because honestly, I'm not really sure what the answer is at this point. I think I think we should look at it in this way. This kind of initiative, like global security initiative, like before, new security concept and holistic security and so far and so on. Right, these are big ideas thrown out there by the leaders, and then I believe we should look at the situation on the ground. What's actually the practical necessities of Chinese diplomacy to actually give shape to Chinese behavior. So in the sense, these initiatives make space, makes political policy space for thinking about certain types of tools of statecraft, certain kinds of behavior. So like in the past, a new security concept as the open door that allowed for the possibility of thinking of military approach also to non-traditional security issues, and that developed over time. But again, it's a very, I think such kind of thing, given the the political salience of anything related to the military in diplomatic terms, political terms, and so on. I do not think there is a specific plan or a specific relationship, especially between global security initiative and military operations other than war. I think that really will depend on, if that will exist, if that will actually come into being. I think it depends a lot on the actual necessity, kind of on a case-by-case basis that Chinese policymakers have to face. So it kind of create the framework, but just because, we are in the global security initiative does not mean that then we will necessarily have global military operations other than war. I think, it's very likely that that will not be the case if there's no actual demand on diplomatic side, let's say more engagement in UNPKOs, or on the security side, let's say more citizens that have to be protected and so on. So I know it's a bit of an unsatisfying answer, but I think we can only wait and see. Like a lot of things in Chinese diplomacy, we can only wait and see, because big announcement, but then a lot of pragmatism and adjustments on the ground. So difficult to tell at the moment, I think.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to weigh in on that question?
Yeah, if I could just briefly add to
Please.
the complexity of it. I think Andrea's comments are absolutely correct. I think one area, at least under the Global Security Initiative, that I've seen direct kind of connections made between senior Chinese politicians to the initial speech and the introduction of the GSI was around dialogue, like security mechanisms. Saudi Iran has been one that's been more heavily kind of, I guess, pushed in recent months, including last month's engagement between the Saudis and Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi, where there's been this direct linkage of, underneath the new global security initiative as introduced by President Xi Jinping, there's been a focus on, let's collectivize security dialogue, right, discourse in areas such as the Persian Gulf, where there are protracted situations, conflicts, and basically bind all this together in a single dialogue. So you see kind of a move away from, at least in this case, it's still military diplomacy in some extent, security diplomacy, but you see diplomacy less on the mil side, taking more of a central role. Again, that is like within months of the introduction of this, and I think Andrea is right that it's one of those let's wait and see. But I do find that very early, right out of the starting line, emphasis on discourse and creating these dialogue mechanisms to be an interesting development.
Excellent. So I'm going to grant us a few minutes extension, and I'll apologize to our comms folks after the fact. So just because we've gotten some audience questions I think are worth addressing, I will take a crack at two of them and then open for your responses as well. So we had one question pertaining to updating the report to cover emerging technologies and domains like space and cyber and information warfare, which are all recognized as domains of conflict, which I suppose would also be incorporated in military operations other than war if they're carried out by the military. Although in the cyber domain, you might also refer to non-military war operations to chop up the term a little bit. So I think that that is something worth considering, and we'll have to see how the conduct of any military operations other than war in those domains emerges. We also have a question about how Chinese military operations other than war may have differed from those carried out by the US over the years. Two quick related observations that I would make are, one, the hesitation to violate sovereignty, and two, the reluctance to use deadly force. Those are two things that China has really not been comfortable doing. And even under circumstances where their forces are called upon to defend themselves, there have been difficulties using force abroad. Counterterrorism operations also, there have been real hesitation about conducting lethal operations overseas. I welcome your thoughts on what differences in Chinese conduct of military operations other than war you might note also. Okay, moving right along, we also have a question about would you ever see peacekeeping outside the UN umbrella, for example, under SCO auspices, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization auspices, to deal with conflicts in Central Asia, for example. So this is a hypothetical, obviously, but there are mechanisms for counterterrorism cooperation and other forms of security cooperation under SCO auspices. And China has also taken a kind of supportive view of the legitimacy of regional organizations in some contexts to make decisions about local security issues. Courtney, I'm going to toss this one to you if you don't mind, because I think you've weighed in on this as well.
Sure. And so thank you very much to the question that came in from Matthew on this front. I think we can break it down into a few things. And I think in part, we already know that the SCO has taken part in a number of regularized anti-terrorism training operations, a number of what they call peace mission, again, training operations that have the benefit of sort of signaling and deterrence because they tell everyone and invite other players to come observe. And again, this helps prepare and further align different states with their different interests within the SCO, and vaguely one day might help promote jointness and interoperability should there ever be such an actual mission overseas that the SCO might engage in. But I think that really is sort of the question mark part. To what extent the SCO would really push forward in this. And then the second real question is, to what extent would China really participate if there was, in some hypothetical universe one day, such an operation? If you were asking me to place my bets at this point, I would say it would be highly doubtful that China would deploy to an SCO operation without UN Security Council support. Regional willingness to deploy is one thing to regional related problems, but I think China's become quite sensitized now to the different interpretations of what those particular regional problems might be. We've seen increased media the last couple of days pointing out the strains between the China and Russia relationship over Ukraine, outright statements about what China might be interested in seeing in terms of US movements regarding Ukraine, for China to also make further movements from its largely abstention-driven position on the Ukraine question. And so I think, again, there is this sense about, as Andrea keeps stressing, these sort of individual contingencies and context-specific responses that I think at the way things are going now, I would find it very difficult to see China deploying to a mission, even through the SCO, for a problem within the region that the SCO had all agreed to deploy to in this theoretical universe without UN Security Council support. And again, of course, China and Russia both carrying those veto positions at the Council. But thanks.
May I add one point to this? Just
Please
a
go
very
right ahead.
small one. And I'm actually building on Courtney's work in reality to make this point. I think it's important just to remember that the fact that China is a big player inside the SCO does not change the fact that the UN remains the main authority that China recognizes in international affairs. And so anything that somehow might even be seen somehow as diluting, watering down UN influence, such as, I think China would not want to see that. And so probably would sacrifice SCO operations or SCO actions or actorhood, let's put it this way, if that would be seen as diluting UN influence in international security affairs, and especially in its own neighborhood. I believe in a particular neighborhood like Central Asia, in which you have Russia, you have all the post-Soviet states with their own divergent interests, and of course in the SCO now you have Iran, you have India, Pakistan. Very complex. I think sometimes we don't have to strategize too much. The UN is such an easy go-to forum. Why go into other places, especially because China is a permanent member of the UNC. So why relying on other organizations?
Thanks very much. And just to address the last question we have come in is about the role of China in Kazakhstan during the unrest and also their security arrangements with the Solomon Islands. I think in both cases there's formal security cooperation between it's a bilateral security cooperation agreement in those cases, and so their participation in the security of those countries is at the invitation of the government. If that, hopefully that's the answer to the question. All right, well, we will wrap up there. I think that what we have made clear is that this is both a rich area for research and for policy discussion that is very relevant to both the current geopolitical circumstances that we face and also China's view of the role of its armed forces in its foreign policy. Military operations other than war, I think, are essential to how Beijing understands its ability to advance foreign policy objectives and to shape the international security environment. And the last point that I'd like to make is that I think it's essential that analysts and policymakers, especially in the US and globally, can better discern between the kinds of conduct that are genuinely potential threats to regional peace and stability versus those that actually have the potential to strengthen and contribute to a rules-based order. I'd like to thank everyone for tuning in for this discussion, and especially to thank our panelists for a really impressive set of remarks. Thank you all for joining us, and we'll hope you take a look at the report.
Thanks for the invitation.